There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
I would like to welcome back for her second appearance, Margot from New Brunswick. Margot, how's life in New Brunswick?
Well, today it's pretty wet, but otherwise it's good. It's a wet, cold Labor Day, but otherwise things are good.
It's Labor Day. I forget all about Labor Day in Japan.
Yeah.
It's fitting that you're back in Canada to talk about a very much beloved Canadian novel by Margaret Laurence. And which one are we talking about? A Jest of God. We're talking about
A Jest of God. Yeah.
And this is part of, it's kind of loosely referred to as a series, the Manawaka series.
I think there's 5 books that she wrote that are part of the Manawaka series, and it's like a small town in Manitoba, a fictional small town in Manitoba. And each story, they're loosely connected, but what connects them is they all take place or are connected to this town in some way. So this one, I think there's 5, and this one is about a woman named Rachel, who is in her 30s. She's an elementary school teacher and she's unmarried and she lives with her mother. Each of these books in the Manawaka series are kind of very detailed character studies. So it's really a deep dive into this woman's life and experience. And it's starts out pretty depressing. Like her life feels pretty circumscribed. I mean, she has this kind of needy mother that she takes care of. Her father was like the town undertaker, I don't know, ran the funeral parlor, and he has died. And there's some sense that he was an alcoholic and a loner. And so the mother and Rachel still live over the business, like they sold the business, but where they live is still over top of this.
Well, that makes quite an atmospheric picture in my mind. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
And I believe she's kind of under her mother's thumb, or she's kind of infantilized in a way.
Yeah, she definitely is. And it's funny, when I was thinking about this book, I read it with some other people, and we use the word spinster lit for books about spinsters. And
I love spinster lit.
I can't take
giving
credit.
it that name, but I love it.
Yeah, it's not mine. I can't take credit for it. Unlike Lolly Willows, I don't know if you've ever read that, or some of those others. Yeah, like they kind of fly off into fantasy, or they have like this powerful sub-story. And this is a very realistic story about a woman living and her only role is to be daughter, and the only other roles that would give her any agency would be wife and mother. The book takes place at the end of the school year, and a former resident who was a little bit older than her has come to town for the summer to hang out with his parents, and they start a relationship, which prompts a lot of things in Rachel as well. It's beautifully written, and it's kind of harrowing because you just can't think, like, where is the hope in this story? Like, what can possibly, like, what is the happy-ish ending for her? But actually, to Margaret Laurence's credit, there is a powerful ending to the story. Like, okay. Even though for most of it, you sort of spend it feeling like, what could I possibly hope for her?
Okay, very interesting. And we're not going to talk about the ending, obviously.
No.
But I'm curious about the title. So I'm expecting that it's kind of something that it feels like God's laughing at this situation.
Yeah.
Very intriguing title.
That's interesting. I haven't really thought a lot about the title, but it does come up. Like, she has a deep fantasy life. Like, I guess that is one of her outlets. So she has, and she has like ongoing conversations in her head. She has deep social anxiety. It's actually kind of uncomfortable in scenes to read it because her anxiety is so high. And so she has like this ongoing dialogue, I guess, with God. She doesn't really believe in him. At the same time, there are times speaking to God is one of her outlets.
And knowing what I know about Margaret Laurence, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that the fact that she has a summer romance, that isn't some kind of being rescued by a man. It's not that kind of a story.
No. Yeah. I mean, I think Rachel would like it to be that kind of story. Okay. But
Margaret Laurence doesn't let her get away with that. Doesn't let that happen. Okay,
no.
That's good.
And it's interesting, like you are kind of trapped in Rachel's mind, and she has this social anxiety, and it's really well written, and she's constantly second guessing herself. And so sometimes it's really even hard to understand the characters around her, because her perception is like, she's like, oh, I shouldn't have said that, or that was a stupid thing to say. So sometimes it's
reliable narrator. I think I saw on Goodreads, this is a reread for you.
Yeah. I fell in love with Margot Lawrence kind of as an undergrad, like, and read, like, maybe when I was 19 or 20, read all of the Manawaka series. My favorite at the time was The Diviners, which I have not reread yet. My memory of A Just of God, I mean, it did, like, it kind of horrified me. Like, I thought, I do not want to end up in a married spinster woman. It was like a cautionary tale. But rereading it now, the social anxiety is so palpable throughout it. And as someone who does have social anxiety, like, I probably connected with Rachel and her thinking without even knowing that was what was happening when I was 19 or 20.
That's fascinating. So you've read the entire Manawaka series, and now are you systematically rereading it from start to finish in sequence?
Actually, I don't even know what the sequence is.
Apparently, this is the second one after the Stone Angel.
Oh, okay.
The Diviners is the final one. I think, I don't know if that's the order of publication. I assume it is, but that's what I found. Stone Angel, Jest of God, The Fire Dwellers, A Bird in the House, and The Diviners.
Okay, well, yes, it turns out so I'm reading it with some other people on Litsy.
Oh, great.
Scott and Leah and Suba.
Leah, my Leah, not my Leah, but the Leah that I worship and love. Great.
Yeah. So Scott and I read The Stone Angel together, and then some others joined to read A Just of God. And now next month we're reading The Fire Dwellers. I assume we're going to try to work through all 5 of them.
I have read The Stone Angel when I was too young. I was about 15, and I remember I liked it. I don't remember much else about it. It was an extremely old lady, and probably a lot of things went over my head. And then I studied A Bird in the House in a Western Canadian lit class as an undergrad, and I haven't read any of the others. So I would start at the beginning and read it through one of these years too.
I think she's a wonderful writer. And actually, I was a little scared to reread her because I had loved her so much in my 20s, and I was like, I'm going to reread this and it's going to be disappointing. But it's the opposite. It's like, and I don't know if she's known outside of Canada. I
don't think she's well known enough. I think the books are in print across the English-speaking world. I think they are, but I don't hear many people talking about her. But we're changing that as we speak.
Yeah. My unofficial, unresearched hot take is that there would be no Alice Munro or Margaret Atwood without Margot Lawrence.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's a very, very astute observation. So, Margot, this is great. And when are you going to start your BookTube channel?
I don't think I'm a BookTube person. I do like talking about books, but I don't know that I'm committed enough to create a BookTube channel.
I'm not. I don't have an ulterior motive in wanting you to come back, but I do have a bit of an ulterior motive in wanting you to come back. You'd be a great booktuber yourself.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
I will. I'll keep working on you. But for now, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, definitely read the Manawaka series.
I am delighted to welcome for his debut appearance on Bite Size Book Chats, Areeb from India. Areeb, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's so great to have you here. And I have been trying to get you on. You read it seems like several books a week that I'm very interested in, but the one that I've got you here to talk about today is, I'm not even sure how to geographically situate the author, but I guess we would say a Costa Rican, Puerto Rican writer, Carlos Fonseca. The novel is Natural History, translated from the Spanish by Megan McDowell. And this novel, I'm really looking forward to seeing how you're going to describe it, because it sounds almost impossible to describe.
I think I will just take your cue and go ahead. Like, I don't think I can properly describe it without actually going into the details of it. So this is his second novel to be translated into English, and I love Megan McDowell. Ever since I read Samantha Schweblin's Fever Dream 2 years ago. And after that, I've been trying to read all of her translations. So I think I've read 5-6 authors by now. And this is my 10th translation by her. So I think I read a review where somebody compared it in terms of structure and ideas to Roberto Bolaño's 2666.
Okay.
In how there are 5 parts, and all 5 parts are very, very different from each other, and they're following different characters, and they're set in different timelines. So I think the basic story here is that there's a historian at the New Jersey Museum of Natural History, and he's contacted by a designer. She's a very famous, a very young, successful designer. And she wants to collaborate with him on a project. And so they're sort of throwing ideas at each other, and they're talking about, so one of the chief, so like, for example, you have these 5 dots on the cover. And this is a shape called the quincunx. And it is supposed to be symmetrical, naturally occurring shape. And it's supposed to have very strong symbolic significance. Like, for example, you have the golden spiral and Fibonacci sequences, stuff like that. So it's very prominently displayed, for example, in butterfly wings and moth wings, like you'll see it in the striations and the designs. So they are both fixated on the idea of the quincunx, and they're talking, and the historian has written a paper on the quincunx. So that's how they get in touch. And they're just throwing ideas at each other. They're talking about how camouflage happens, and how in nature, and how subterfuge happens, and abruptly the contact ends with the designer. And 7 years later, the historian finds out that she's dead. And he knows that now that she's dead, everything that they prepared for, the notes that they were making, are coming to him. And just as he has expected, a car comes off, drops off her diaries, and he's left with the chore of trying to piece together what actually she was trying to do, because she never actually confided in him, like what the idea was or what the background was. And so that's basically the first part. And he's going back and forth 7 years in the past and in the present. And then he's trying to piece together the life of the designer. So the second part is about, this will go on. The second part is about her father, who is an Israeli photographer. And he comes from Israel to America because he wants to go to the end of the world. He wants to go to the extreme south, and he thinks that there's a transformation happening there. So he comes to America, his life changes, and he becomes a photographer, and he gets into designer photography and fashion photography, where he meets her mother, who is a famous 1960s American supermodel. And her mother is also interested in all of these arcana and all of these prophecies and apocalypses and doomsday occurrences. And they both are stoned, and they both are like, it's very turbulent here. They're both taking a lot of alcohol, consuming a lot of drugs. And then the daughter is born. And then 10 years after the daughter is born, they hear about a prophet in, I believe it's in Mexico, but I'm not sure. I'll have to check again. But it's in it's a South American country. They hear about a prophet, and they decide to leave everything and just go visit the prophet, taking the daughter along. And some stuff happens there. She's left by her mother. She's left by her father. The mother disappears completely. The father goes to this remote town where there are mines, and the mines have got fire. So there's a perpetual fire burning under the town. So he's staying there, he's taking photographs, and he's thinking about his life. His mother, meanwhile, resurfaces 10 years later under a different name. And she has this whole artistic project, which is basically the crux of the book. She has this whole artistic project where she's writing fake news articles under aliases, publishing them in local newspapers, which are then getting picked up by international papers. Meanwhile, the local newspapers have already said, sorry, the story is false, we are retracting it. But the international newspapers have no clue, and the news is circulating, and it's changing the stock market, it's changing geopolitics, and it's affecting international affairs on a very, very wide range. And this she has been doing for like 10, 20, 30 years. That's where the central idea of the book about modern art and what's the place of modern art in our lives right now, and how modern art is getting increasingly distant from contemporary reality, and how we've we look up our noses on conceptual art and modern art as elitist, or creating something that isn't there, or like manufacturing value, but it's very, very intrinsic to how we live our lives and how art and law are connected. Like, for example, what is illegal and what is illegal? What what the law, like for example, if you're drawing notes, currency notes, then technically under some laws that is punishable because you are sort of creating a fake currency. So what are the limits of art? What are the limits of law? How do they both interact? And it sort of just goes around there.
And politics too.
Yeah, politics too. And
politics. And I'm intrigued by this. I mean, you described it so well that you've given me a fabulous headache. It's really a densely layered and plotted novel. My concern about this novel for me as a reader is I'm worried it might be too intellectual for me did you care about the characters, or is it really a novel of ideas?
I would say definitely not a character-oriented novel. Like, it's definitely more about ideas. Like, the characters are there, but the characters are more present to talk about these ideas or to present us with these ideas than there are characters or the character arcs of themselves. Like, for example, in one of his interviews, Fonseca talks about how the division between fiction and essay is artificially created and shouldn't exist.
Okay.
So I think and he name checks a lot of authors like Thomas Bernhard and W.G. Sebald, who he takes inspirations from. So it's sort of the same thing. In a lot of these places, he's talking about real life historians, he's talking about real life photographers. Like, for example, the French photographer Nadar, who pioneered aerial photography. He went in a balloon and he took aerial shots. And he's one of the main characters in Julian Barnes' Levels of Life. So that's how I remember him. So a lot of connections with other works. And I don't think it's difficult to read as such, but it definitely requires intellectual engagement.
Yeah. So I'm not sure it's for me, but you certainly have intrigued me that I'm going to give it a try. Have you read anything else by Carlos Fonseca?
No, I haven't. This is my first book. Like, I have been wanting to read this since last year when it came out.
We were talking rather frivolously before we went live. I just watched a couple minutes of a video, a Zoom thing that he and Megan McDowell did, and he is drop dead gorgeous. Oh my goodness. I'll put a link to that video in the show notes. But it's interesting, when I look at my Goodreads friends, you loved it, and several loved it, and then several have DNF'd it or really actively disliked it. So it's a bit of a Marmite book, as they say in the UK.
I think if you'll realize after reading like 20, 30 pages when you finish the first part, which is, I think, it's pretty short. Like, the first part is
it's only 320 pages. So for all of that,
it's about 72 pages. So once you're done with these 72 pages, you will know for sure whether you're going to like it or not. So there's no point of torturing yourself here.
I think it's worth a try. Areeb, this is great. I hope you'll come back.
Definitely. I definitely want to come back. This is fun. Thank you so much, Sean.
This is a very special chat with somebody who I've been friends with on Litsy for many years, Paula from Auckland, New Zealand. Welcome, Paula.
Hi, Sean. It's lovely to meet you.
Oh, so great after all these years. So you are Centique on Litsy. I'm going to put your Litsy handle in the show notes. People should follow you. You read a wide variety of stuff. I was quite interested in a book it's kind of like a memoir, perhaps, or a series of published letters going back to the colonial era of New Zealand, Stationed Life in New Zealand by Lady Barker, published 1870s, something or other.
Yes, that's correct.
And you didn't have very high expectations going into the book, and you were pleasantly surprised. So please tell us all about it.
Yes, so I thought that a book full of letters from a lady, an English lady living in colonial New Zealand, would be quite dry and boring. But what makes it special is she has a great sense of humour, and she's very enthusiastic about this, radically different life that she's come across the world to enjoy. There's a large part of it in the beginning about the voyage from London through to Melbourne and sort of the difficulties of being on board a ship and seasickness and so forth in 1870. And then she finally makes it to New Zealand, and she's got this huge adventure ahead of her to get out and live on her new husband's sheep station in the middle of the South Island.
Her new husband's sheep station in the middle of the South Island. So I don't know what the South Island is. Can you educate me?
Oh, okay. So New Zealand is broadly made up of 3 large islands: North Island, South Island, and Stewart Island.
Oh. And I have a feeling, knowing you as a reader a little bit, that you kind of read it in a kind of post-colonial way. So tell us a bit about what you liked and what you kind of had to supplement it with and problematize. Yes. I'm very curious.
Yes, about this. Yeah. So it's definitely, it is problematic in a couple of ways. She's obviously a very privileged British person. She's gentry, basically. She comes to New Zealand and she's really roughing it from her sort of view of the world, but her roughing it still means having 3 servants in her house. So it's not very rough, except for the fact that these are very early days in the colonial times, and you really can't make where she is, which is quite a, these days it's about an hour drive from Christchurch, but back then it was a 2 or 3 day sort of journey through mountains and rivers and, fording rivers. You can't really ignore the climate or the what nature throws at you. It isn't a Victorian city. So she has these adventures, she has to deal with floods and snowstorms and what appealed to me, but also found it quite ridiculous, is they would decide to go off on these very sort of English picnics and try and get to these picturesque spots. And they're, bringing along with them all these sort of accoutrements of an English picnic, which they're then trying to scale half a mountain to and make everybody carry these things up with them so she can have cups of tea in all these different spots of the country. So there's a very privileged point of view. She mentions Maori only maybe twice, okay. and so it is completely oblivious to what was going on for our Indigenous people, our Maori. So certainly if anyone was looking at reading a book about 19th century New Zealand, I would also recommend they read at least another book by an Indigenous author.
Great. And I think you have one to pair with it that you would recommend. Why don't you tell us about that one?
Yes. So the book that I'd recommend is called The Imaginary Lives of James Pōneke by Tina Makereti. And I'd recommend that also to anyone who is interested in a great historic Victorian novel, because this is this epic journey of a young Māori man from childhood through to adulthood. And the incredible thing about it is it's a fictional story, but it's based on some facts about a real man that was taken by an artist. An artist had come out to New Zealand to paint this new part of the British Empire, and he was painting Māori in different villages around the place. And he took this young man around with him as his translator, and then he eventually took James back with him to London and put him in an exhibition, like a colonial exhibition of his work. So he became like a living exhibit. And then he continued to have other major adventures. So Tina Makereti has taken the basic facts of this man's life and built a fictional story around it.
Oh.
But just the roots of it are so astounding just by themselves.
That sounds not only like a great pairing to read with this rather colonialist series of memories, but also really fascinating in its own right. So thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So,
I was tickled pink to find out that Lady Barker, she was born in Jamaica.
Yes.
Her father was the island secretary of Jamaica. So she comes from really the colonialist administrators.
Yeah.
Educated in English. She married Captain Robert Barker, had 2 kids. He was knighted for his leadership at the Siege of Lucknow. Do you know what that is? I didn't look it up.
No, I didn't.
Something horrific, violence, colonial, terrible atrocity. And then he died 8 months later. She
remarries.
She remarried Frederick Broome, but she kept calling herself Lady Barker because her new husband wasn't knighted. But then eventually he got knighted
Yes.
They returned to England. So they were in New Zealand during the 1860s. Is that
Yes,
right?
they were only here for 3 years.
Yeah.
And then this massive snowstorm really sent them home in many ways, because I think they lost about 3/4 of their sheep in this incredible once in a century snowstorm. But then he went on to have these diplomatic postings. So she published her book of letters. These are letters to her sister. She published, I think, 2 books of letters from New Zealand. And then she goes on to South Africa and then in Western Australia, as her husband is appointed as a governor in both of those places. And she ends up writing about 6 or 7 books in total.
Including a cookbook, I think.
Yes, yes.
So finally, her second husband was knighted in 1884, and then she became Lady Broom. And for one or two of her last books, she was published under Lady Broom. She was no longer Lady Barker. So that's all fascinating, and talk about colonialist bullshit.
Yeah.
Fun.
From a colonial perspective, she shows no insight. From a gender perspective, there's one particular story where the men are going off on a hunt for some wild cattle, and she insists on coming along with them, and every male in the group is most put out and keeps talking about, why is there a female here? So she does throw herself into these adventures that are considered completely inappropriate for someone of her gender and standing. So there's a really good humor in it. So it's more like, it's quite a short book, and it's more like, I'd say it's quite a humorous read. And also for me, her depictions of nature. She talks a lot about the bird life, the plants, the mountains, and she's seeing it obviously without cities and without roads and so forth. And was beautiful. It's really beautiful for me to be able to enjoy that with her.
Right now, I'm reading a Indigenous novel. It's so experimental. I guess it's a novel, but called Nupaming by Leanne Betasamosake Simpson. And I didn't realize, and I'm about halfway through it, just published this year or maybe late last year. Just an incredible novel. I'm reading it very slowly, but I didn't realize until I was about halfway through that this is her, and she is an Indigenous writer and an activist and singer, multi-talented, and that she is writing back to one of the very first books ever to be published in or about Canada, which sounds kind of similar to this book in New Zealand. And that the author is Susanna Moodie, and she was an early settler to Canada before Canada existed. And her memoir was Roughing It in the Bush.
Oh, yes.
Published 1852. So I am planning to read it for Victober. On BookTube, there we have this Victorian month. October is the Victorian Literature Month, so I'm going to read this Victorian memoir and kind of be reading it alongside this Indigenous work of experimental fiction, which is kind of answering back. So, yeah.
Oh, that sounds great.
Paula, this is great. Will you come back?
I'd love to.
Yay. I am delighted to welcome a BookTube friend to Bite Size Book Chats for the first time, Freddie from Malaysia, who has his own fabulous BookTube channel, which I am hereby, through this chat, shouting out. You all need to go subscribe to Freddie. His channel is called Sluggish Reader. Welcome, Freddie.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. And you're from Malaysia, but you're going to pronounce the name of the city because I don't think I can do it.
Yeah, it's pretty long. I live in Johor Bahru. Yeah.
And which part of Malaysia is that?
It's actually at the southern tip of Malaysian Peninsula, just right nearby Singapore. Yeah, very close to Singapore.
Great. Now, the book that we're going to talk about is in a completely different part of the world. It's set in Germany, and it is a novel called Reunion by Fred Uhlman, which you loved. I'd never heard of this novel. Tell us about it, Freddie.
So I read this novel, I think it was 2 to 3 months ago. I actually have not heard of this novel before that as well. So I got it, and it was really short, so I just read it right away, and really loved it. So The reunion is actually this. It's a very short novella. It's about it's a friendship story about these two boys who lived in Stuttgart in Germany. It was the 1930s and was around the time when Nazism was about to gain traction in Germany at that time. So we have this narrator. His name is Hans, and he's a teenager, and he befriends this guy in his class. His name is Konradin. And just a bit of background information about these characters. Hans is his family is Jewish, and Konradin, his family is this white German aristocrat, and so they already have this like different backgrounds at the beginning of this novel. But we see how Hans is like, he sees this guy coming into his class and he is immediately infatuated with him. He really wants to be his friend. He has always been kind of a loner before that, but when he sees Konradin, he is literally just fascinated with him. But it is exactly because of the changes that are happening in the society back then that causes their relationship to sort of hit this kind of drama at the middle of the book, and how the relationship sort of resolves at the end.
Fred Uhlman, what I found is that he was of German Jewish background, and he went into exile in London, but also Paris, various places, but lived most of the rest of his life in London. So he wrote this in English in 1971.
Yeah, this book was actually published fairly late in his life, and I think it was also written quite late in his life as well. And when it was published, it was not really popular. And I must say that even up until today, it's not really popular. Even though I think that this book is really good, it's really accessible. But yeah, it is simply not popular. But it's really fascinating because this book is kind of autobiographical. There are some parallels in terms of the events that happened in this book to the events that occurred in Uhlman's own life, like his departure from Germany right before Adolf Hitler rose to power. So yeah, that was fascinating. It makes you kind of wonder how much of this novel is like really, really personal, but you can really feel that this novel is, there's this kind of earnestness in this novel that you just, makes you feel very close to the author, really, really intimate.
So the gay man in my readerly brain has to ask this question, because when I hear the plot synopsis, I automatically think, is that there a bit of a homo component to their friendship? A reader like me will see it whether it's there or not. But is there anything overt in the story?
This is a really fascinating question, and I'm not sure if it's going to count as spoiler or not. Maybe not, but no, I would say that there is no homoerotic undertones in this novel. But while I was reading this book, related to this question, because this book is about friendship, and the friendship that is featured in here is really interesting. The dynamics between these two guys, you can really say that the friendship is super passionate. It's incredibly passionate to the extent that it feels like almost a romantic relationship. And actually, there is a passage in this book. The character Hans himself, he's the narrator. He mentions how his feelings towards this friend is almost like they were, lovers. So there's certainly that. It is kind of obvious in that sense. But yeah, it's definitely extremely passionate.
Well, that really sounds like a Sean book. So, without giving anything away about how it ends, or how the friendship, whether it continues or there's a break, we don't want to reveal any of that. But how would you describe the tone of the story?
Most of all, it's very nostalgic, because I think that because the narrator pretty much tells us this story from the point of view of someone who is much older, When this story ends, it doesn't end when they were still teenagers. It actually ends when they're a bit older. The part of the story in which they're still teenagers is probably being told by a narrator that has some kind of, insight, hindsight regarding the things that transpired in their adolescence.
Freddie, you have done an absolutely incredible job of selling me on this novel, and I think many a reader. So I hope you'll come back and sell us another book soon.
Sure.